everyone. My name is Kawanda Brownlow. I am the founder and executive editor of AM Posse, a digital magazine for, about, and by professional women of color. I am so excited that I have the pleasure of moderating today's hashtag Higher Black panel, Conscious Recognizing Your Unconscious Bias. Our two speakers for this panel are incredibly talented, each of them boasting a long list of impressive achievements. We have Trier Lynn Bryant. She is currently the Chief People Officer of Astra, an aerospace company based in Northern California. She is a strategic HR leader with distinctive tech, Wall Street, and military experience spanning almost 15 years. She has been featured as an influential HR and diversity and inclusion practitioner by several publications and outlets from USA Today to CNN and SXSW. Trier has an unwavering commitment to employees within organizations to create a more equitable, inclusive, and thriving culture to produce prosperous companies. She also advises leading companies like Equinox, Airbnb, Rockefeller Foundation, and Novartis on their talent and D&I strategies through her own consulting company, Pathfinder. Trier began her professional career as an officer in the United States Air Force, where she led D&I and talent development initiatives for the Air Force Academy, Air Force, and the Department of Defense. Welcome, Trier. So happy to have you here. We also have Stacey Gordon. Stacey Gordon is the CEO and Chief Diversity Strategist of Rework Work, a company that reworks how companies work by focusing on how they inclusively recruit, hire, and engage employees, effectively creating inclusion and belonging for all. As a consultant and career strategist, Stacey has written career and diversity-related articles for SHRM, Fast Company, Forbes, NPR Radio, BBC Radio, and Essence Magazine, just to name a few. She is also the creator of the #1 resume course at LinkedIn Learning, which is well on its way to accumulating 1 million views. Similarly, her unconscious bias course has been featured by LinkedIn, Microsoft, and Virgin America. It has also been translated into several languages. She has been recognized by Pepperdine University as a top 40 over 40 leader and by Forbes as a top 3 business leader who spoke out about diversity and inclusion. Welcome, Stacey. So happy to have you this afternoon. So,
Thank you.
So unconscious bias is a very broad subject, but we only have 1 hour. So this panel discussion is going to focus on a few of the ways that unconscious bias affects Black women and the recruiting and hiring process. So I want to start with some definitions so that we're all on the same page. Stacey, I'd like to start with you. How do you define unconscious bias, and how does it affect Black women as job applicants?
Yes, so unconscious bias, it's big, like we said. I mean, it's really a way, right, for us to categorize each other. And it's just based on a way for us to do that without thinking, right? It's an old school thing that it's innate, it's within us. So it's a shortcut that our brains take. And it's affected actually by our social, cultural, and religious norms. And this is why people from different regions, different areas have different thoughts about what's right and what's wrong, because our norms affect this. And so the shortcuts are foundations of stereotypes and prejudice. And that's what leads to discrimination if we don't pay attention to the decisions that we can make without thinking. So you're going to say, well, how do we pay attention to decisions that we make if we're not thinking about them, right? And a lot of times when we talk about bias, we have an expectation that we're only going to be talking about race and ethnicity. And that's not always the case, because there are hundreds of types of bias. So I think that when we specifically talk about the way that unconscious bias affects Black women in the workplace, I mean, not to get political, but we can immediately think about, Kamala Harris, right? And how she was treated during the debates. And many people will say, well, but everyone is rude in the debates, right? Nobody gets to finish their sentences. But I'll tell you, I really didn't want to watch because one of the first things I thought was like, great, we're going to get all the memes about the angry black woman, right? We're going to get all the memes about what it's like trying to get into an argument with a black woman, and I just wasn't in the mood because those are the kinds of things that happen in the workplace, right? Like if you want to speak up and you want to say something, you stop and you think like, can I really say it like that? Because is it going to be taken for what it actually is, or is it going to be heard differently because what I'm saying, someone is going to interpret as me being angry rather than me actually having a valid point.
And Trier, I see you nodding. Is there, do you have some comments on this? I know you do.
No, I just appreciate using Kamala as an example because we knew that that was what's going to happen. And, for those of us that have been in those type of settings, we know the tropes and the stereotypes that people have of Black women and what's to be expected in that narrative, unfortunately. So appreciate you using that example.
Yes. I do want to just throw out a few statistics. So, ethnic minorities have to complete 50% more applications on average to get invited for a job interview when compared with candidates in the majority. According to new research from Harvard, when job applicants have similar qualifications and the only difference is their skin color, white candidates gain 36% more callbacks than Black applicants. So, I say that to say that we know that bias is very real when it comes to hiring and recruiting practices. Trier, I'd like to talk to you about diversity, equity, and inclusion. So these are terms that are often used interchangeably. Could you speak to the difference between each of them?
Yeah, thank you so much. Appreciate the question because you're right, especially in this moment in climate where we are having more of these conversations and dialogues, but people use these words diversity, equality, equity, belonging, inclusion interchangeably, and they're very different. So focusing in on DE&I, diversity, equity, and inclusion, diversity is really having all the different components, it's all the different elements, it's all of the different intersections and identities that people have and bringing them together. So it's the composition and it's the numbers. But when we're talking about, something being equitable, we're talking about, justice. And we're talking about, is it equitable and is it equal for the process, for any type of process or any type of experience that folks that diversity is experiencing, right, in the workplace. And then you have inclusion. And inclusion is that state, an act of being included, right? It's do you feel included? Are you not excluded? And so for a candidate, through the candidate experience, diversity is, hey, we have very diverse candidates that are applying for a role. Is the process that folks are identified to actually having an opportunity to interview and how that interview experience is that equitable, right? That's where the equity and the equality piece comes into it. And then the inclusion is once that person is hired, what does it feel like in that organization? What does it feel like in the workplace? And how is the experience as an employee there? And so they're very different and they are very nuanced and have very different strategies to allow an organization to be successful. I'm a very visual person. So if you want a visual representation of some of these words, one of my favorite, there's this depiction of the giving tree. We are all familiar with that book of the giving tree. And so the giving tree, the tree is leaning to one side. And so inequality is that tree leaning to one side, which means one side is getting all of the apples. Equality is actually when we say, hey, one side is getting all the apples, but they can't really reach the apples. So let's give them all the same height of ladder so that they can reach the apples. But what happens is that because the ladder is the same height and the tree is still leaning, only one person now can actually reach the tree and get those apples. Equity is saying, okay, we realize that they probably need different heights of ladders. So we'll give the person the height of the ladder that they need to reach the tree because we know that the tree is leaning. But what we really force organizations and what I challenge leaders to think about is justice. And justice is the infrastructure that we put in place that moves the tree from leaning to being upright. And then if we choose to also give everyone the same height of a ladder, they equally can reach the tree because the tree is now standing up. So what I force and think, what we really encourage leaders to think about is, what is that infrastructure within your company that allows for justice, that you recognize that the tree is leaning, and what can you do to reinforce to get that tree to be standing back up?
Right. What are some of the strategies that that you recommend as far as things that workplaces can do to make sure that they're promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Yeah, so even just from a hiring point of view, one of the things that, not only have I implemented within companies, but also help companies, is if we know that, we may have underrepresented applicants that are applying, but, they just don't have the same access to their networks of like understanding what might be those unwritten rules of being successful in that process. I'll give an example. When I worked at Goldman Sachs, there were some very clear and known within certain groups unwritten rules of things that you had to do to be successful in that process. One of the things I learned very quickly is at Goldman is that you have to ask thoughtful questions. But there was a way to define thoughtful questions. And thoughtful questions were questions that you can't just go and Google or find the answer on the Goldman Sachs website, right? And what we saw was that candidates from underrepresented groups, maybe they didn't know someone who had previously worked at Goldman or interviewed at Goldman to understand that, right? And so what we do is we partnered with the employee resource groups and the affinity groups, that when we had women, Black, Hispanic, Latinx candidates, we would kind of give them a coach, mentor, someone that helped them, encourage them through the process. No one that was part of their interview panel, someone that was completely neutral, didn't even have to be someone from the team, but just someone that created a safe space for that candidate, that could give them those tips, that could say, hey, what success looks at Goldman in an interview process are these things. You can do it. Do you have questions? Someone to help, guide them through that process. And it's something very, very easy that could really make a difference, And you're just thinking about, like, how would you feel if you were interviewing at a company and a company gave you someone and said, hey, we would love for you to connect with this person. And it's someone that you have an affinity with because you may identify in the same way. And they're there to answer all of your questions, right? And so that's something very simple that organizations can do that really make a big difference on a candidate's experience.
Yeah, yeah, that's really great. Stacey, do you have anything to add to strategies that workplaces can undertake?
I do. I think it's interesting. Just yesterday, or maybe it was the day before, because the days are still running together. But a couple days ago, I got a message. I get tons of messages from individuals through LinkedIn, and so I want to say thank you to Julia for recommending my courses to your summer intern, and thank you to Tana for finding Higher Black Summit through my socials. Appreciate it. And so I do get a lot of messages. I do try to read them all. And because I get things like this, where a gentleman sent me a message and he said, Stacey, I love your unconscious bias course. It's really great. We watched it. And so now I'm looking at my job descriptions and I'm trying to figure out why it is. He's like, maybe the job description is gender biased because we put out this job and we have 95% of applicants are men. And so he sent me the job description and said, well, what can you say about it? Less than 5 minutes. Took me 5 minutes to look at this job description and go, okay, all right. And I'm like, well, before I just jump to conclusions, let me go look at the website. So I go look at the website. I go click on the About Us. All I see are white men. Literally every single picture was a white man, right? So that was like, okay. So then I click and I see a video, and I didn't even click into the video. Just the thumbnail of the video was like two white guys on a mountaintop, and then on the bottom there were like two more white guys at a conference table. And I just sent him a screenshot of both of those things, and I said, "What do you see?" I said, "And in your job description, you say that it's required that you want people from these industries." And I listed the industries, and I said, well, all of those industries are all traditionally male industries. So how do you expect to get more women when you're saying you want people who have traditionally come from those industries, and all of those industries are traditionally male-centric?
Yeah.
So it's like, these are the kinds of things that, like, I just thought it was kind of funny that he couldn't see that, right, in that job description. He's like, he can see something's wrong, but he has no idea what that thing is. And
Yes.
so that's just what I'm seeing a lot, is that people really want to help. They want to make a difference. They want to do, as Trier said, to write the tree. But they have no clue. Like, they're literally standing there with the things that the tools that you need to write the tree, and they don't know how to use them. They're like, wait, what do you
Right.
mean? I know I've got a ladder, and I've got rope, and I've got
Mhm.
like a shovel I've got like the metal spikes, everything I need, but they have no idea because no one's ever told them that this needs to be done, and no one has shown them how to do it, and they literally just no clue.
Yeah, I would love to just call out one tool to Stacey's point. I think all companies need to be running all of their job descriptions, all communications through a fantastic platform and tool called Textio. I encourage all companies to use it. I use it at every company, where I'm leading TA recruiting organizations. But so this is an example of justice. We know, we've heard the statistics that when women see a job description, they feel like they have to, if there's 10 requirements, women want to feel like I'm only going to apply if I meet all 10 of those requirements. Men, on the other hand, feel like 30 to 40% of the job description, yeah, I might meet that. I'm going to throw my name into the hat and go after that role, right? And so what Textio does is Textio allows you to write job descriptions with a different tone. And so one of the things that, we do and that I encourage organizations to do is to write all of the roles where you're actually looking for women, like you're looking for women engineers, write your job descriptions to have a women tone, where it's going to attract women, where it's going to encourage women to apply. Men aren't going to care either way. They're going to apply. We know that they're going to put their hat in the ring for the opportunity.
Yeah.
And so, but when we talk about that, when we talk about diversity, there's also a difference between diversity and representation. And a lot of people conflate those as well. So for me, on my people team, men are the underrepresented group. So we actually write our job descriptions for the roles on the people team to actually have a more male tone so that we get more men applicants, because that's underrepresented for us. So it's just being strategic and being thoughtful, but Textio is a fantastic tool to help you with your job descriptions.
Okay, we have a question from the chat, and Textio might be the answer to it, but Bridget Williams says, I remember there was a startup that had a machine learning program where you could add your job description and find unconscious bias. And the question is, do you know if that type of software still exists?
Yeah, there's a lot of different tools out there that will flag things. I think Textio is just one of the best in what
Okay.
is becoming a very oversaturated market. But the other
Okay.
thing that I will say, and we all know this, is how many of us actually read a full job description when we're applying to roles. Like, we're searching for titles, right? And there's, unfortunately, hiring managers are not putting the time that is needed into job descriptions to really understand what the role is, which is even more frustrating, because then you have those conversations with recruiters where we've all had that experience where you read the job description, you're like, yeah, I could do that, I'm excited about that. And then you get on the phone with the recruiter or hiring manager and there's a disconnect. That's why it's
Right.
really important for candidates to ask really good questions, to really understand what they're looking for, the profile of that candidate, and then what your skill set is to match that.
Yeah. I think that's also why it's really important for the hiring manager to get the job description right, because
Mhm.
they put a lot of the onus on the candidate, and it's like, you need to get the job description right, and on top of that, you need to be really specific about what you want. So it's
Mhm.
no longer okay to just keep recycling the same old job description that you've been using for 5 years, right? Like, that needs to be updated, and it needs to be updated to a point of, do you really need this person to have 10 years of experience in a certain tool? Like, how important is that to the job? Is it really necessary? So many of the required skills that are in job descriptions don't need to be required. Like, we really have to have a hard look at all of the requirements that are in there. Do you really need this person to have a college degree? Do they have to have a college degree in this specific area? Like, let's look at our own backgrounds and ask ourselves, am I doing a job today that actually I have a college degree in? Answer for 98% of people is going to be no. So why do you expect that everyone else has to meet this standard that makes absolutely no sense in the real world? It's like, I absolutely hate it. It drives me up a wall. And like, there has to be some accountability on the side of the hiring manager, because what happens is the recruiter bears the brunt of the frustration of the candidates. And that's not fair either.
Right. And I'm glad that you brought that up because, like you said, there are so many different forms of unconscious bias. And I do think that one of those forms is, well, I want to find somebody with this particular skill set, even though, well, I shouldn't say this particular skill set, this particular background, even though someone could possess the same skills and come from a completely different uh, training background, schooling background, what have you. But because, like you said, the hiring manager has decided, well, we're just going to stick with this rote set of, we want them to have 10 years, even though they could probably do it if they had 2 years experience. Just not having any diversity when it comes to the different backgrounds that you would consider for a candidate. I also want to bring up, I've had the experience where I was working with a company in the Midwest, and there was definitely, I was living in an area that had no diversity. And there was a bias against people who were not from that area. And my concern was always, how on earth are you going to recruit people of color when you are only recruiting from an area that has very few people of color? So I think that these are things that people in HR need to be aware of, because you can't recruit people of color if you're not recruiting people of color. So I want to move on to the falsehood around pipeline issues, especially when it comes to recruiting and hiring people of color. I know that I've heard companies say, basically blame their lack of diversity on a shortage of talent. How do the two of you deal with that when you're working with a company that says that? And Trier, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I appreciate the question. This is one that I feel very strongly about because I spend a lot of time doing university campus recruiting with students, and um, I'm very conscious and aware of the damage that's been done to students and to this younger generation that have aspirations of being in STEM and being in an engineer and being in tech. And when there's this constant narrative that says there's a pipeline problem, what we're basically saying to these students and to these professionals is that we don't see you. And so it's a combination of the damage that does to people to constantly hear it's a pipeline problem, it's a pipeline problem. Then we're saying, well, we don't see you, we don't recognize your talent, we don't acknowledge you. And that coupled with the fact that, like, we have a lot of folks that are deselecting themselves, out of this. They're choosing not to be a part of these, or they're choosing not to be a part of these industries and work at these companies. And so when someone, self-selects out of a process, that's hard. And so one of the things, I would encourage you all to look this up, but one of the campaigns that, when I was at Twitter, one of my teams created that I think is my most proudest campaign that we did there was called #YouBelongInTech, #WeBelongInTech. And this came from the person that was leading my diversity recruiting team at the time. I was having a conversation with a student, and they were an engineer, but they said, even though I'm an engineer, a software engineer, they were like, I'm not going into tech as an industry. I'm not wanted there. They said, I don't belong there. And so that next season, we created swag, and we had this whole campaign that we gave the students that said, I belong in tech. And then we would wear shirts, and we had swag that said, you belong in tech. And it was to reinforce to professionals, not just students, but that you belong here. There's a place for you. And it didn't matter if they were getting jobs at Twitter or the companies that I worked for or not. It's just that we need to make sure that underrepresented folks know that they belong here. There's a place for them here, and that they don't just have to survive in tech, but that they can thrive in tech. And it is not a pipeline. It is not a pipeline problem. And one of the things that I really challenge recruiters and hiring managers both are that, to your point, you can't make you think diversity recruiting is challenging because you don't know diverse professionals. You don't have diverse networks. Okay. So like if you're going to the Caribbean looking for ice caps, people would think you're crazy. So why are companies getting away with saying, oh, well, we can't find diverse talent, but where are you looking and where are you choosing to build relationships? And so I challenge folks to say, before you even worry about making a hire, you need to take 3 to 6 months and just build relationships, real, authentic relationships, because that actually matters most when you're dealing with underrepresented groups. Because for underrepresented professionals who are in organizations and they're doing well, their companies know what they have and they're taking care of them. They're retaining them. Hopefully, they're paying them well. They have mentorships. And so to get that talent out of that organization takes effort. So we need to start going out and building relationships with underrepresented folks authentically, not even about a hire, just to build relationships. And then when that opportunity comes up, then you talk about how hard it is to go do diversity recruiting, because you'll actually have a network of people that you can tap into.
Yes, I completely agree.
Yeah, the building relationship is so important, because that's what we do, right? I mean, look at the networks that we're in. I'm in a ton of different networks. I'm sure all of you are as well, where we send information back and forth about companies. And I get a lot of people, again, through LinkedIn, they'll send me a message and say, oh, we're trying to do, really increase the diversity of our hiring. Can you recommend someone? And I'll say, maybe, depends. Let me look at your company. Let me see. And so what I do is I take those job descriptions and I drop them into a couple of different networks and I get feedback and I go, yeah, 100% would not recommend. And I take that feedback and I give it back to the hiring manager. I go, I just want you to know I circulated this in my network and here's the feedback that I got. And I will quote, would not recommend, no diversity in hiring, all white women who are in your diversity and inclusion team, no budget allocated for diversity and inclusion. I interviewed a few weeks ago and the salary was terrible for what you want the person to do. And I'm like, here you go, here's the feedback. You asked me to go and circulate the job description. I did. Here's the feedback I got. You should know about this. Go fix it. Right? Like these are the things that they have to do. And I think that the other thing is if you look at, Wells Fargo was in the news again, right? This time this time they weren't fleecing Black people. That this time they were talking about the fact that they can't find Black people, in their pipeline. And that is, again, it's such an insult to Black people and to anyone really. When you say that you can't find these individuals. It's like, really? So you are so lazy and you have not built the relationships and you have not done the job that you're supposed to do. And then you're going to blame the very people that you say you can't find. Like that is just, it's so
Yeah.
not, I can't even find the words. It's just so
Mm-hmm.
disrespectful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The other thing that I want to do call out though for anyone who you should go to your recruiting teams, you should go to your leaders. The other thing that we found with Pathfinder, my consulting company, is how uninformed decision makers are of what you can or cannot do. And legal teams, you could have a general counsel and associate general counsel, but they are not employment lawyers, and not understanding. There's so many recruiters that say, oh, well, I can't use the data, the self-ID data that someone said. Oh, it's illegal if someone says, oh, I want to hire a woman engineer or a Black engineer. It's not. And you have to really understand the nuances. And so a lot of companies, they'll say, well, we can't find diverse talent. And then I actually go into their applicant tracking system, pull and say, well, you have like 100 underrepresented candidates here across all these different recs and you haven't reached out to them. Oh, well, we didn't pull it by that data because we don't feel comfortable. Like, we don't see color, or we don't want to highlight or just target people like that. And it's like, no, that's a strategy. That's called being strategic, right? And so there are companies that you literally have the talent in your system, but you're not proactively doing anything with it. So again, it's just the laziness and it's the unawareness, and it's just, quite frankly, like the mediocrity of both sometimes recruiting teams and hiring managers. And when you have a mediocre underwhelming recruiter with a mediocre hiring manager who's not a strong leader or doesn't even know what their job and responsibility as a hiring manager, it makes for a really terrible experience for our company. And you're not going to be able to move anything forward when it comes to diversity recruiting. And those two are the key people in the process that you have to get it right.
Right. I mean, a couple things is, first of all, diversity recruiting doesn't exist. Diversity recruiting is just good recruiting. So
Mhm.
if you want to be a good recruiter, you should always be thinking about diversity. So having to think about diversity recruiting as a separate thing is already a problem. On top of that, as recruiters, especially in-house recruiters, if you're sitting at your desk waiting for these people to magically drop into your ATS, again, you are not a recruiter. You are a waiter, because your job as a recruiter, it's an active thing. You're supposed to go out and recruit. You don't sit at your desk and wait. So that's another thing that is happening, where people are not actually actively going out and doing the job that they are paid to do. And on top of that, the ego of people to say, well, we just want to hire the best. Okay, so you're trying to tell me every single time that you have hired a white man, he's been the best. So there's been nobody else. The best has always been a white guy every single time that you've had a job opening. Like, it's just so ludicrous when you say that out loud.
Definitely. And infuriating. So I want to move on to some specific examples of bias, specifically bias against Black women in hiring and recruiting. And I'm keeping track of the time. There's so much that we could talk about around this, but one form of bias against Black women in the workplace comes down to our hair. And so, Stacey, I was wondering if you could just talk really quickly about bias against Black women's hair, Crown Act, and basically just some things that are going on uh, in this space to prevent bias, to prevent that kind of bias.
I mean, so the first thing you could do, if you Google professional hairstyles, right, what you're going to get is you're going to see a bunch of white women. If you Google unprofessional hairstyles, you'll get Black women, right? So right there, the bias is right there. The amount of times, for 20 years, my hair was permed. No other way was my hair done than permed, because I was taught, like many of us, that the way to get a job was you had to have your hair straight. Otherwise, you weren't getting a job. It was unheard of, really, in the 90s, to go to work with your hair in an afro or in braids or any of those other kinds of styles. And so I'm just so thankful and so grateful that we have evolved out of that. Because my hair is in braids, I got kinky twists in, and I enjoy having my hair braided. And so the Crown Act was passed in California last year, which stands for actually creating a respectful and open world for natural hair. And it came out of a coalition that realized, finally, what we've been saying for many years is the amount of discrimination. If you Google discrimination in hair for Disney, Six Flags, FedEx, there are lawsuits after lawsuits after lawsuits about the fact that individuals who had dreads could not be hired. And Disney, for a long time, they got away with it because they said, well, the costumes and the this and like, we really have to realize that there are ways around this. And what really was happening was, this was just an easy way to be able to remove people from the pipeline. Even better news is that last month, the House of Representatives has passed a bill at the federal level, meaning now that, if approved, these protections will actually automatically apply across all 50 states, because as it stands right now, it's only California, New York, New Jersey, and I think like 3 or 4 other states that have passed their own state versions of this bill. So that means that HR individuals need to be going back and looking at your dress codes, right? Also, was it July or June 15th, Supreme Court, added the LGBTQ protections, right, to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So you have to be you're supposed to be making your workplace gender neutral. You need to go back to your handbooks. You need to go back to all of these different things. And so those are your practices, right? And your policies. You got to look at those policies and say, what do they say? Then you've got to look at, how are we putting those policies into action? How are we practicing it? So as Trier said earlier, you've got to be talking to your hiring managers. part of the reason that diversity and inclusion is so difficult in the workplace is because a lot of it is not diversity and inclusion. A lot of it is just you need better leadership development. You need management training, and that's not happening. So when I come in and you want me to now help you to navigate diversity and inclusion, I'm like, hold up. These folks don't know how to treat anybody with respect. So how are we supposed to get to diversity and inclusion? This is why you can't get there, because your practices, your policies, your procedures are terrible. They are bad. And I'm sorry, but someone's got to tell you that it's not working.
Yeah. I have been in some workplaces like that, so I am glad that you were telling them the truth, Stacey. I want to really quickly move on to another form of unconscious bias, and that is around name bias. So, names that sound too other. For example, applicants with quote unquote Black sounding names receive 50% fewer callbacks than that of their white counterparts. Trier, what are some other forms of unconscious bias in the recruiting and hiring process that people in positions to hire should be aware of?
Yeah. One of the things I want to call out on the names is when we're talking about unconscious bias training and we are talking about examples, one part that a lot of people don't realize is that where you grew up and where you educated, you have a different perspective and lens on that training. So, for example, we had someone, not Stacy, should have been Stacy, not Stacy, at a company that I was at, do unconscious bias training. And a lot of our hiring managers were Asian, and Asians who were educated, born, raised, and educated outside of the US, and then after college came to the US to work. And so they just don't have the historical context and the understanding of, a Black sounding name or something like that. And what ended up actually happening was that the unconscious bias training introduced that bias to them. And then they actually started to incorporate that into
Oh,
their
wow.
hiring things, right? Because they just didn't understand. They were like, what, Black sounding name? Oh, and like, people don't want to hire Black people. Oh, okay. And so it introduced that bias to them actually. And it was specifically around names was the example that they just were not familiar with. And so there are other forms of bias,
Mhm.
but the thing is that we have to be very thoughtful and conscious about how we talk about it because everyone's coming from a different starting place. And so there's other things that we see in the recruiting process as well, right? I think one that like I have actually had to overcome, especially with Black women, is we all know that Black don't crack, right? And so a lot of times when people say, oh, you're at what stage in your career? You've been doing this for how long? You're doing that because I look young. Yes, I do. But don't get it twisted. Like I have had the experience, I've done my time, and I have, the results to prove that. And I joke a lot that I am 25 and I will actually be in rooms where I joke like at 25 I probably don't understand that, or like the young folks, we say this and people will be like, oh my gosh, Tria, you're really 25. And I'll be like, can you not do math? Like I was active duty for 7 years in the military. I
Right.
spent 3 years on Wall Street. And then I so forth and so on. And so I've seen that in debriefs after someone has been interviewed. I cannot tell you the horrific things that I have heard when it comes to Black hair, right? Women's hair. This was before the Crown Act. Oh, well, they don't present in a professional way. We can't put them in front of our external clients. We can't put them in front of our external partners because, Trier, their hair doesn't look like yours and mine. Well, let me tell you what's under all of this Indian Remy, right? Because this is not my hair. So
Right.
there's a lot of education there. But it's even biased of, whether it's like how someone will act under pressure, how someone will communicate. My favorite that, I always flag and we do training that we're not allowed to use the F word in our debriefs. That's fit, because there's so much that can hide in and behind that word. When someone says, well, I just don't think that they're a good fit for the team or
Mhm.
a fit for the function. It's like, well, what does that really mean? There's also this bias that we hear a lot. Oh, I would love to go and have a beer with them, right? Like after work. But you don't hear people saying that about women, definitely not, non-white women, like, oh, I can't wait to go have a beer with this candidate who doesn't look like me afterwards. And it's like, who cares if you want to go have a beer with someone after you interview them or not. Like, can they get the work done? What is the actual value add? And I think that, one thing that we will let you learn is, and I've learned this as I've gotten, more experience in my career and engaging. And I think that I am having the best professional experience with my CEO right now. But the reason for that is because I have managed my CEO, the person I report to, his expectations. This is how I show up. This is how I will communicate. This is what's going to happen when we don't agree. And that's okay. And we're not supposed to agree on everything. And this is also what happens when you violate my trust. And you're only going to get so many opportunities to do that. And this is what I need to build trust. And then not to say that like everyone is at this point of, their career where those conversations are appropriate or there will be an opportunity. But what I do want people to know is that, managing expectations, showing up authentically from the beginning and asking those questions, when you're sitting down with the manager, like, how do you disagree with people, and sharing how you communicate. And if you get to the point where it doesn't make sense for you all to work together and it wouldn't be a good working relationship, that's great. But being open about those things so that people know, what you expect and what you need. I think talking through that, it gets people to the best result, right? But there is a lot of bias in the recruiting process. And the first step of dealing with that is acknowledging it. And that's really hard for people, especially people from the majority, especially for white men, especially for white women. But we have to have those difficult, discussions and those challenging conversations to make the progress that is long overdue.
Right. I completely agree with everything that you said. And I know that we're coming close to wrapping up this panel. So to your last point about becoming comfortable with being uncomfortable when it comes to conversations around diversity, what should allies be doing in the workplace to become more comfortable with that discomfort?
They've got to speak up. They have got to understand. And then this is why, and because it's so polarizing. When you say this is why you have to be anti-racist, right? And they don't understand because they think, oh, we're about to start and go down this whole road of talking about racism, and it's like, no. The example is, I was coaching a woman who said, and we've had many of these kinds of conversations, but this one woman said, well, it's frustrating to be a white woman and to have people look at me and assume that I'm racist. And I thought, so it must be interesting. Wonder what that's like, someone to look at your skin color and make an assumption about you. Like, but we ended up having the conversation where I told her, I said, I get it. Is it right for people to make assumptions about you? No, absolutely not. I said, but how are you going to change those assumptions unless you actually speak up? Because every time that you are silent, your silence is agreement, right? It's taken for agreement, whether you mean it that way or not. So you have to speak up. And she finally got it. She was like, wow, like I have to say something. And so that's what we mean when we say that you need to be anti-racist, because you actually have to speak up against it. You have to say something. You have to do something. You cannot sit in silence. So I would say to all allies, like, it's going to be uncomfortable, but the more you do it, the more comfortable you will be with being uncomfortable. And the more the words will come, right? We do a whole workshop around microaggressions, how to avoid them, what to say, how to manage it when it comes up. And like, those are the kinds of things that we have to start doing, as allies. You've got to, when someone's talking about somebody and saying something and they're saying, yeah, her hairstyle is unprofessional. Really? Okay. What about her hairstyle is unprofessional? Right? Just start to ask the questions. You don't have to be confrontational. You don't have to get into this negative space, but just make them explain, right?
Yeah.
Don't let people hide behind euphemisms and certain words. Make them say the thing. And once they say it, right, they're either going to get to a point where they're not going to say it because they realize, wow, that's probably not appropriate, or they're going to say it and then they're going to go, wow, did I just say that? But either way, you're going to get your point across without you having to be that person, confronting them. The confrontation doesn't always have to be negative and angry and big, right? It just doesn't have to be that way.
Yeah. To my point on that is, I actually think that we are beyond allyship, and so we need advocates. And the difference between being an ally and an advocate is action. So to Stacey's point, like, you have to say something. You need to act. You have to speak. You need to put your money where your mouth is. Like, we need advocacy. We need advocates right now. And so allyship is just way too passive for the work that we need to do. And the other part is that people need to stop saying, like, oh, it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. It ain't even a marathon. Because for those of us who have run a marathon has an endpoint, right? We know how long a marathon is, thank goodness, right? This work is never ending. This work is never ending. It is a journey, and we have to make those personal commitments in our lives, in our communities, at home, and at work, to say, how am I going to show up every day and do the work, right? And I love the example that Stacey gave of, like, it's just so interesting, because I've had these conversations with white women as well. It's like, oh, it's just so uncomfortable to be a white woman, and this and that, and all the Karen memes and all this other kind of stuff. And when people say, like, I'm tired, I'm exhausted, and it's like, welcome to being not part of the majority. Like, this is our lives every day. So quite frankly, I don't want to hear that it's tiring. What I want to do is what you're going to do tomorrow and what you're going to do the next day, because I don't have a choice of how the world treats me. But you do have a choice to show up as an advocate, to do this work, right? And we all have to do it together. And so I encourage people to be advocates, to show up. And people say, I don't know where to start. Google. You literally can Google everything. And there's so much content out there. There's so much information out there. There's free information on LinkedIn. There's information. There's so many resources. And so you have to start with just educating yourself and doing the work with those personal commitments, right? And even being a part of events like this, I see people making comments, and, they're not Black women, and that's fantastic. So, people are here to listen and learn of how they can be a part of the solution and do that work. And that's step number one. But it is a journey, and it is not a marathon. It is not a sprint, but it is an ongoing journey, and we have to make that commitment every day.
Yes.
Yeah. And I'll make that little plug. I'll just say, you know what? The Unconscious Bias course is out there. LinkedIn has made it free. It's free for the next couple of months, at least through the end of the year. It's 24 minutes. Like, have a cup of coffee and watch the Unconscious Bias course. You can Google it on LinkedIn Learning, and have all of your employees watch it. And then that's what you can do, right? Here's an action. Watch it, have a discussion about it. What did you get out of that? What can we take out of that, and what can we implement? What do we need to change? What aha moments did you have, right? There's a ton of questions that you can make up, that can come out of that, just to get the conversation started.
Yes, definitely. So it looks like we have 2 minutes left. So I want to thank you both for sharing your time and insight with us all. I truly enjoyed our conversation. I have learned so much. I am sure that all of our attendees have as well. Attendees, thank you so much for joining us. I do hope that you'll continue to participate in dialogues such as this one, because we need people who are willing to listen. And as Trier so eloquently pointed out, we need people who are willing to act. We need advocates if we are ever going to succeed in truly making workplaces diverse, equitable, and inclusive for all. So thank you again, and please enjoy the rest of today's amazing summit.